AI will affect the global majority, which is highly underrepresented in these discussions and policy discussions and in AI development. So we're very excited to have this fireside chat on trustworthy AI in the Global South. We welcome to the stage our moderator, Yolanda Botti-Lodovico from the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And we're very honored to welcome Member of Parliament of Tanzania and Chair, African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, Honorable Neema Lugangira. Welcome, Neema. Thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda, and thank you to the audience who's here joining us today, as well as all of those who are joining in from home. And thank you to the organizers and the hosts of this important event. Neema, it's such a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss a critical topic, and that's trustworthy AI in the Global South, or what we might refer to as the global majority. As many of you know, Neema brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this discussion, which for too long has prioritized global North voices and perspectives. But what our goal is over this next 20 minutes, and I would argue over the next 20 years, is to make sure that we're broadening the scope, to make sure that we are centering the perspectives and voices of global majority communities in these AI dialogues. So today we'll discuss the recent developments in the AI landscape and what their implications are for the global majority. But importantly, we'll also discuss the role that global majority leaders play in both crafting internationally aligned regulations that support and protect the rights of their local constituents, and also in empowering the creation of a new wave of pro-social technologies that really have the potential to create a better future for people and our planet. And at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, we are deeply optimistic about the progress and the opportunities in that space. And we've seen just how critical the ideas and vision of global majority communities and civil society is in making those developments possible. So Neema, let's get started. You come to us today as a member of the Tanzanian Parliament. You are also a member of the Interparliamentary Union. And you founded the African Network, the Parliamentary Network of Internet Governance, which, for those of you who don't know, is a pan-regional network of 35 lawmakers across 30 different countries, whose goal it is to increase and amplify African voices in increasingly complex global discussions on AI governance. So talk to us a little bit about what is your perspective on some of the topics that are coming out of those discussions, and what's your vision for AI governance in that space?
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. As introduced, I'm Neema Lugangira. I'm a member of parliament in Tanzania, but also the chair of the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance. I must say that I am sincerely grateful to the Future Society for extending this invitation to myself to be here. As you might all know, that it's very uncommon to have representatives, especially legislators from a developing country in Africa at these events. So it's not something that I take lightly, and it's something that I wish to call upon all of you to make more efforts into making sure that we have we have an inclusive voice of the Global South on the Global North. Very quickly, just to continue, when we're talking about issues of artificial intelligence at the IPU level, back on 27th of October, we had the elections of the IPU president, and luckily and very ably, my speaker from the Tanzanian Parliament is now the new IPU president. Her Right Honorable Dr. Tulia Ackson is now the IPU president, and alongside that, I joined up with a member of Parliament from Canada. And submitted a joint proposal to the IPU on making sure that the IPU should have a resolution on the impact of artificial intelligence on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, which was endorsed. So it's something that we're working on and hopefully will be passed in the next IPU assembly next year. Now, in terms of African parliamentarians on this topic of artificial intelligence, I think that's one of the reasons why I founded the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, is to try and see how can we bridge the gap of the African legislators in this space. Because for so long, these discussions are happening in exclusion of us, while we have the fundamental role of creating the laws and the enabling environment in our respective countries. So it is our hope that through APNIG, we can be able to have the right capacity building to create the right laws in place. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Neema. And then just diving a little bit further into your extensive experience in the policy advocacy space. I understand that you have a deep passion for various areas of sustainable development, from global health to food and nutrition security to gender equality in politics and in digital governance. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about what are some of the critical opportunities that are emerging in this space, both in Tanzania and across the region, and how can the international community support in developing some of those solutions?
Thank you. I think when we're talking about artificial intelligence, if it's used correctly, I can give an example. If we talk about the issue of food security, we can use artificial intelligence to know and predict famine situations, flood situations, and even it can be used to inform government decisions in terms of, budgeting on, if we take, for example, soil health, which part of the country's soil needs what type of fertilizer, etc. So there are those opportunities. Similarly, when we talk about gender equality, if the issues of gender-based violence, we can already know maybe which types of gender-based violence are more common in which parts of the country. So planning and government planning, as well as international organizations, can plan better in those spaces. Again, with health, in our public health sector, there are challenges of maybe access of different kinds of medicines. So if we use the artificial intelligence, then we can be able to know maybe which parts of the country need which types of medicines more and be able to budget and plan accordingly. So there are benefits in that nature. But then on the other side is, for us to truly harness these benefits, we need to have the right knowledge of what is AI. We need to have the right infrastructure in place. We need to have the right legislative and regulatory framework in place, because without that, then the rest of us coming from the global south, a country like Tanzania and other African countries and other developing countries in the global south, will end up being, we are a big market, but we can be a big market that will be taken advantage of because we don't have the right policies and the right framework in place. So I think it's very important when we're talking about artificial intelligence governance to making sure that there's that inclusivity, and we bridge the gap between global north and global south. So I believe that the global north has a responsibility in this case, because most of the artificial intelligence companies are coming from the global north. So if we keep the things the way they are right now, we are going to end up being disadvantaged and taken advantage of because we lack the same kind of systems that are on this side of the world.
Thank you, Neema. And I think you bring up an important point when you talk about the importance of deeply relevant systems and infrastructure to support these developments and the policies that go along with it. So I want to talk a little bit as well about digital public infrastructure. We're hearing a lot more voices sort of call for the further development and strengthening of digital public infrastructure as a way to create a new story around technology and its capacity to develop services and solutions for communities that are equitable, that are deeply responsive to their needs and interests, and that are sustainable in the long term. But at the same time, we have a number of models, such as digital railroads in India and digital payments infrastructure in Brazil, that while they could be applicable to the situation across the AU, it's also important to implement community-centered design of these solutions in a way that responds to the unique aspirations and objectives and the context across the AU, the diverse context. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about what's your vision for DPI across the African Union, and how can we empower community voices to participate and own the creation of that infrastructure and solutions?
Thank you for that. I think whilst being mindful of time, obviously, I can just give a very small example that I come from a region called Kagera. We're a border region. We border Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. So in my region, if I fall sick and I go to a dispensary, I'll have my blood work done. And then if maybe I get medication, I'm not well, then I'll go to the district, I'll go to the health center, I'll have to redo the blood work. Then if I'm not well, I'll go to the district, I'll have to redo the blood work. Then if I get referred to the regional, I'll have to redo the same test I've done all along. Now, when we're talking about infrastructure in artificial intelligence and the use of technology, if all of these different stages in the health system, they can be connected, it can save a lot of time, save a lot of money, and even possibly save lives. Now, you can talk about having infrastructure, the hard infrastructure as one point, but then the other side is the soft. The people need to learn how to use these tools. Oftentimes we forget about that. People need capacity building to be able to use these different technologies. So that's the other part. I think it's very important to do. And right now, like in Tanzania, we've started through the government, the Ministry of Health and the ministry responsible for ICT are talking about things of like digital health, but with that investment and using AI and the advancement of technology in the health sector, you also have to make sure that you capacitate, the health staff and the personnel. Now, you brought up the issue of the African Union. I understand that the African Union right now, we're in the process of putting together the kind of the AI, strategy for Africa. I think one of the things that I can emphasize is, with the data protection through the Malabo Declaration, we saw that we had the Malabo Declaration, which had, the data protection, but it took over 8 years for it to be ratified. And one of the things, and I believe it's an important missing gap that needs to be continuously strengthened, is the issue of members of parliament. Oftentimes when, stakeholders are engaging on such initiatives, they would engage with the executive government. And they assume that parliament is part of the executive. Meanwhile, it is not. So it's very important to always remember, in whatever engagement that you're doing, you must also engage parliament, because things can be agreed upon at the executive level, endorsed and signed, but if it's not translated into law, then it's not going to be applicable. If it's, the difference between the EU and the AU is that when a law is passed in the EU, it's automatically, it's implementable across the EU countries, whereas in the AU, laws still need to be ratified in the national parliaments. But if you're excluding the members of parliament in those discussions, then there is going to be a gap. So one thing that I would like to see with artificial intelligence is that we should do things differently. And I'm glad I'm seeing in the room Marielza from UNESCO, is that we should, and this is something that we've been talking about, we should do things differently in the sense that making sure from the beginning we engage members of parliament, because we need to know what is going on. We need to know what is artificial intelligence. We need to know how are we supposed to, deal with this unknown fact. But if we are left in the dark, we're going to create the laws that we know, and those laws may not be aligned to what you know, and then there's going to be a pointing finger game, but then it's like, hello, you're not engaging me. So if you're not engaging me, you don't really have the right to point fingers at me if you're not engaging me.
I think that's a great point, Neema, and thank you for bringing that up. I think that brings us to a conversation around sort of aligning priorities across regions and really making sure that we're engaging the various parliamentary members across the AU. And that brings me to a discussion around how the OECD and the AU are sort of organizing this dialogue to be held in March of 2024. In which an important topic of conversation will be the continental strategy on AI. But they'll also talk about, identifying shared priorities for AI governance across the two regions, finding areas for coordination and collaboration, and identifying mechanisms to amplify African voices in international governance discussions. So I'd love to hear from you, what are some of the top objectives that should be coming out of those conversations? And then on a related note, how do we approach those conversations with a bias towards action and implementation? I think it's great to get together and discuss these things, but how do we actually put these steps into action?
Thank you. I think what I would like to say, first of all, is to recognize and to appreciate the recognition that artificial intelligence is having at the Global North stage. We saw that in October, the UK Prime Minister hosted the UK AI Summit. But if you look at the representation of countries at the UK AI Summit, you'll see that Global South countries were truly underrepresented, let alone members of parliament from Global South. I'm not sure if at all we were there. So when you have such a meeting and then you have a conclusion that this is the global perspective on this issue, but it's not really a global perspective because there's a global majority which is not part of that global perspective because we're not part of that discussion. Similarly, you come here to the US and we've seen that His Excellency President Biden signed the executive order on artificial intelligence, which is great. It's a great move. It shows leadership. But then I'm wondering how are we engaging in terms of Congress with members of parliament from African countries so that we can learn from each other and making sure also the decisions that they're made on this side are informed. We have the EU AI Act, which is possibly going to come into force, I think, by June 2024. So again, in terms of the timing, we're planning this AI governance dialogue in March 2024. How is it going to really have an impact on these other moving blocks? Are we late? Are we not? So I think one thing that I would like to emphasize is to making sure that whenever we are starting these discussions, at the very beginning, we need to think of the Global South. We need to think of the global majority. We need to think of Africa. Africa should not come on board at the end once everything is done and dusted and then suddenly, hang on, we need to engage Africa. But is our input really going to be taken into account when all these other moving blocks have already been done and concluded? That's a question I'm leaving to you guys. Is that inclusive or is it not? And mind you, most of these companies, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, the biggest piece is data. Rarely do we hear the issue of data monetization being discussed in the global north, because companies are coming to Africa, collecting data freely, monetizing the data. And meanwhile, when our own governments want to have access to that data, they need to pay for that data. Is that right? Is that inclusive? Is that governance? I leave that to you.
Thank you, Neema. You bring up many different critical points, and I think that data piece is crucial as well. When we think about the fact that a lot of this data is being exploited, and the African Union and many other communities across the global majority are often seen as new markets for AI consumption, but at the same time, they're not elevated or given the opportunities to become producers and creators and designers of AI, solutions that they end up owning. So my question for you is, how do we foster the conditions necessary for global majority communities, for civil society, for change makers across the global majority to participate in AI creation and to not only join in the benefits of the economic progress from technological progress, but also to create solutions that directly address the challenges we see in communities?
I think what I can say in concluding everything is that one thing that we need to do is we need to have a minimum standard of acceptable behavior of AI. And why do I say this? Because when you have a law in the EU, the AI companies will behave remarkably well within the EU. But when they come out of the EU, all that good behavior disappears. So I believe when we're talking about AI governance, it is important to ensure in the laws that are being enacted in the US, in the UK, in the EU, Australia, Canada, etc., there should be a minimum level of acceptable behavior such that if you're a company who was registered in the EU, and if you misbehave in Tanzania, we should be able to use that act in the EU to make you accountable. Short of that, it's not going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Neema. And I think that that's a great note to end on. But also, I want to invite you to make a call to action to the folks who are here today and the folks who are listening at home.
So obviously, my call to action is a no-brainer. Please, in whatever you do, make sure you include members of parliament. Whether we like it or not, it reaches a certain point that we politicians can either make it or break it. So it's very important to make sure that you work with us, you capacitate us, you include us, and we find ways in which we can together create this enabling environment. And the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance is there, and we're ready as African parliamentarians. And thank you again, once again, for the Future Society for having me here, and thank you all of you. Asante ni sana, thank you.